Hi, everyone. It's Paul Kigabine with the Garland County Library in Hot Springs. And joining us to talk about Eureka Springs, it's Sean Fitzgibbon, who is the author of the new release, What Follows is True, Crescent Hotel. And this is a graphic nonfiction that explores the stories surrounding Eureka Springs' famous Crescent Hotel and its strange and tragic 2 years as the Baker Hospital, a Depression era cancer hospital. It's 240 pages of fully painted graphic narrative, blending oral histories, newspaper articles, and Norman Baker's own vanity biography. And Mr. Fitzgibbon is going to break down why he's been drawn to such an unusual place and how he got involved with the infamous Crescent Hotel and all the research that went into his book, which you can find at the Garland County Library. We'll have a couple copies available for checkout, or of course, he'll tell you all about his website where you can check that out. So, welcome, Sean. Glad to have you.
Great, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
And this is your first book, is that right?
Well, yeah, it's actually my second. I do have another book that I'm going to be reprinting soon. It was another sort of a self-generated project, and but I'm going to be putting that out again, like in a much nicer format, But yeah, this is pretty much my first real book, and it's been a big, yeah, I mean, it was a labor of love. It was a work, and
Wow.
it's all like oral histories and research, just extensive research from scouring archives and databases, libraries, and interviewing many people, uh, and uh, and it all sort of coalescing in this graphic narrative form, um, which that's what, of course, my other book is as well. That's kind of, I'm a visual storyteller, and that's how I tell stories. I'm an artist. I also, I've done all kinds of, I've gallery work. I've exhibited work. I teach a lot of art classes. I've also done illustration work, and I've, some graphic narrative work. And so, uh,
And, and some
yeah,
of that is available to view and support on your website, which is
yeah,
SeanFitzgibbonArt.com. Is that right?
that's right. Yeah, definitely.
Excellent. So I encourage everyone to check that out if you like the presentation
Yeah.
today. And like I said, check out the book. And
Yeah, there's a store on my website, and you can just click on store, and then there's books. And well, the book, it's in a regular hardcover, and then there's also a slipcase version that's available as well, along with some. I now have prints on the website store, so prints of original pages from the book. So
excellent. And
yeah,
check out Eureka Springs and the hotel too. My wife and I actually stayed there at the Crescent Hotel last year for our anniversary in
nice.
November. It was a great time, and we did have some unexplained encounters. Um, we can go into that later maybe, but
Yeah,
it's,
yeah,
it's a it is a great time. Wonderful little area there, Eureka Springs, and I look forward to learning more. So I'm going to
yeah.
turn things over to you, and
Okay.
we'll see you after your presentation.
All right. Sounds good. All right. So okay. So this is basically kind of a little presentation that kind of breaks down my book, and I'm going to kind of go from. I'm going to tell it just a little bit about just kind of what inspired me, why I kind of, you know, did this, and then I'm going to tell a little bit about the Crescent, and then also Norman Baker, who was the charlatan that opened the cancer hospital, who turned the Crescent into the cancer hospital in the late 1930s. And then I'm just going to talk a little bit about the process, kind of putting a graphic nonfiction like this together. So, okay, yeah. And so next slide. And okay, so this next slide. Okay, so yeah, so in 2019, which was actually around the time I was finishing this book. There was a very grim discovery that was made on the grounds of the Crescent Hotel in Eureka Springs, Arkansas, and this discovery garnished national attention. Um, so a landscaper was digging. They were putting in like an archery course, and she unearthed these. They're digging, and suddenly these jars came tumbling out. The backhoe shovel went down into the ground, pulled up, and then these hundreds of these little jars came tumbling out. And so immediately, of course, the landscaper, she quits digging, checks out, to see what's going on. And upon closer inspection of the jars, they appeared to contain, well, human tissue, um, of some sort, along with Norman Baker's so-called cancer cure. Now, so the jars were immediately taken to, it was roped off, and as a crime scene, and then the jars were taken to state crime labs and for analysis, and they determined that indeed they were from the era of, when it was Norman Baker's cancer hospital in the late 1930s. And so anyway, so yeah, next slide. So when I was a kid, I want to go back just quite a ways back, and I'm gonna kind of explain why I was so interested in this story. Was this when it was this hospital? When I was a kid, my family would visit the very, Victorian Ozark town of Eureka Springs, Arkansas. And next slide. Um, with its Queen Anne dwellings perched on these limestone bluffs and serpentine roads that don't quite intersect. In fact, there is no intersections throughout the town. It's a very unusual town. Um, the roads serpentine throughout. Um, and there's also a subterranean village buried beneath the main street there in Eureka Springs. It's deemed one of the 9 most unusual towns in the U.S. by Ripley's Believe It or Not. So next slide. And I'm still intrigued by the aberrant maze-like geometry and geology of this stair-step town, along with the historic Basin Park Hotel and its 7 street level entrances on each floor. So this hotel butts up against a mountain, and so you can actually get off at each level and you're at ground level. So it's very strange. Like the whole town's like that. Uh, next slide. It's the only city in America whose entire historic downtown is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Next. None of the streets cross at right angles, and there are no stoplights. The layout of this town is irregular. Next slide. The natural elements in Victorian architecture coalesce where houses and buildings cling to steep mountainsides, nestled in deep gorges along winding streets, each adapting to their own unique terrain. Next slide. However, the most compelling and mysterious feature to me has always been the Crescent Hotel that sits at the highest point of town on Crescent Drive with its very bizarre, dark, and varied history. Okay, so now I just want to tell a little bit about the hotel itself. Next slide. So the Crescent Hotel was built in 1886. And Eureka Springs was at this time rapidly becoming a well-known health resort. And this is due to the Healing Springs, which the town was named after. Um, and this gentleman here in the upper right-hand corner is Arkansas Governor Powell Clayton. So he ended up developing a railroad system that made Eureka Springs accessible to tourists. And he was also credited with getting the hotel built. because the hotel is situated, like Eureka Springs is deep in the middle of the Ozark region, so it's very mountainous. So if you can imagine at this time, it'd be very difficult to get there, unless you had a rail system that could, uh, that basically just went straight through. So anyway, next slide. So yeah, the hotel was designed in a American Gothic style by St. Louis architect Isaac Stockton Taylor, and he used limestone that was quarried from the nearby White River. Interesting little fact is the Crescent Hotel. There's no mortar. It's all just these massive, extremely heavy limestone blocks, and it's gravity that's basically holding the hotel together. Next slide. So yeah, despite its splendor, um, the hotel was not lucrative. Next slide. And the Crescent College and Conservatory for Young Women was founded in 1908 to supplement lagging winter hotel business. So yeah, and yeah, you can go ahead to that next slide there with the rats scuttling forward. Yeah, so this is, and then so after in 1934, the Great Depression came along. Well, this was, during the Great Depression, it ended both the school and the hotel. So the hotel sat empty for a few years until 1937, um, when it reopened as a cancer hospital, and thus beginning the most bizarre chapter in the hotel's very strange and assorted slide. Okay, so yeah, now moving forward, uh, back to when I was a kid. So my family and we would go to the Crescent Hotel, and we would go on these ghost tours, and I would, learn about its very strange history and the ghosts that were said to haunt the premises. Just as a quick aside, I want to let you know that all the images that we're seeing from this on the slideshow are actually from my book. Like, these are all drawn and painted in watercolor by me, and so yeah, this is my entire book is this visual painted narrative, like a graphic novel, but it's nonfiction. So anyway, yeah, they would tell about all these strange, all these kind of like ghost stories, on the of course it's a ghost tour, but then the thing that really stuck with me, next slide, was the story of this fraudulent medical practitioner who in the late 1930s transformed the hotel into this very abnormal hospital. So next slide. And I looked at this as, elements of, I'm a kid. I'm like this, like, 9-year-old kid. And it's like elements of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Stephen King's The Shining. It really just kind of left me morbidly intrigued. So the story, it just haunted me. It stuck with me for years. And in fact, to this day. And so in 2003, I moved to Fayetteville, Arkansas, uh, for graduate school to pursue my master's in fine art. So while in school, I visited the Eureka Springs with my fiance, now my wife, and we went on the ghost tours. So once again, hearing these kind of horrific stories of this flamboyant charlatan dressed in white and wearing purple, coming to town in his purple car with this supposed cancer cure and preying on patients afflicted with the disease. Next slide. Now, many of these very sensational stories involved his liquid cancer cure being poured directly into patients' skulls, and of hundreds of patients unaccounted for and even exorbitant amounts of calcium found in the basement walls and the floor. And so I'm sitting there thinking like, well, who was Norman Baker, and what really happened, you know? And so that was sort of my mission, uh my goal was to really, you know, parcel out, fact from fiction, from, the what actually happened, and separate the, from the mythology and the legends that have grown up around the hotel. And so what I found was actually even more strange than many of the stories that were told. So next slide. So, a little skeptical, the next day, my wife and I, we visited the local library and was surprised to find that there was not a whole lot of information on the enigmatic Norman Baker and his brief time at the Crescent Hotel. So, next slide. I later conducted extensive research that led me to Baker's complicated past. What I found was even more bizarre than the stories that I'd been told. But who was Norman Baker? So let's talk a little bit about Norman Baker. So next. So Norman Baker was born in 1889 in Muscatine, Iowa. He was a machinist turned vaudeville magician. As a means to publicize his stage performance, he developed the first calliope he called the calliophone that ran on air instead of steam. Next. During his time, cancer was becoming the leading cause of death in the US, and his mother died of cancer. So her untimely death created an interest in life extension. So Baker hears of a so-called doctor in Kansas City, Missouri, who claims to have cured cancer. So Baker basically doctor, and then he makes an offer and on his cancer cure, and to do a story about his cure in his magazine and on his upcoming radio station. So, next slide. Baker starts his own radio station in 1925 and begins publicizing his cancer cures and lashing out against his enemies, including the American Medical Association and the Federal Radio Commission, local businesses, bankers, teachers, physician, you name it. He pretty much was in constant litigation and made enemies with just about everyone. Next slide. He opens the Baker Hospital, the first Baker Hospital in a former skating rink there in Muscatine, Iowa. Next. He then publishes he publishes TNT magazine, and TNT magazine is an acronym for the Naked Truth. Um, his radio station was KTNT, Know the Naked Truth. So he publishes TNT magazine in 1929, where, along with medical exposés, it serves as Baker's general merchandising publication. Basically, like a Sears and Roebuck catalog, where you could pretty much buy just about anything from, household products to car tires. Um, in fact, he even had a service station in Muscatine uh, where you could fill up your tank. So, but along with this general merchandising, in his catalog, he claims to have the cure for cancer in his magazine. So, uh, so after getting with the so-called Dr. Ozias in Kansas City and learning of his cancer cure, and then acquiring that so-called cancer cure, Baker offers to treat 5 patients. So next slide. He offers to treat 5 patients with his miraculous cure free of charge. He then prints his December 1929 issue of TNT magazine about the patients in his miraculous cure. By May of 1930, all the patients are dead, and he reprints the story proclaiming his cure through his magazine and radio station again and again, and then one more time without changing a single word. Next slide. The AMA, the American Medical Association, uh, pressures the Federal Radio Commission to crack down on Baker. Baker then loses his license in 1931. After an unsuccessful attempt to sue the AMA, he then starts a radio station on the Mexican border, and by 1934, he's amassed quite a fortune. He considers himself something of a medical expert, although he has never had any medical training whatsoever. In fact, he dropped out of high school in the 10th grade. Next slide. So Baker leaves Mexico and eventually makes his way to Arkansas in 1937, where he purchases the downtrodden Crescent Hotel. The town of Eureka Springs developed around its healing springs, and Norman Baker said in an interview that was an influencing factor towards his move to the Ozark town was the pure mountain air and the healthy waters. Next. So Baker remodels the hotel to look more like a circus than a hospital. The attractive lobby was completely transformed from what you see here to next slide. What you see here, which is he paints the walls and the fireplace with these garish sort of art, these golds and purples and uh, these triangular Art Deco motifs prevalent throughout. Um, Next slide. The beams and the columns were a hodgepodge of orange, red, black, and yellow. And Baker pastes his propaganda posters all up and down the hallways and throughout his entire lobby and hallways of his hotel or hospital, I should say. So next slide. He has many of the interior doors removed and wrote populist propaganda across many of the interior walls. Next slide. On the exterior, the original wooden porches and their wood-turned balustrades were removed. Next slide. And 4 floors of concrete were poured in their place to make sun porches that would support the weight of patients' beds that were rolled out. This changed the building so drastically that it permanently damaged the Victorian appearance of the hotel. Next slide. In Baker's purple walled office was a hexagonal desk with bulletproof glass separating it from the lobby. You can actually still see this desk today at the Crescent Hotel. Next slide. The hospital was advertised widely in his brochure, uh, advertising where sick folks get well and we cure cancer tumor without operation, radium, or x ray. The money was rolling in despite the Great Depression. So, next slide. But sadly, as the patient death toll was rising, uh, this was rising, but so were federal law enforcement investigations. And so, next slide. And in 1939, Baker was convicted of mail fraud and sentenced to 4 years in Leavenworth Penitentiary. Next. After being released from prison, he tries unsuccessfully to start back up his cancer hospital and eventually retires in Miami, Florida, living out his remaining years on a three-story yacht. And he dies of cancer in 1958. So, next slide. In 2008, I interviewed a man who, as a child, ventured into the abandoned Crescent Hotel in the early 1940s with a friend after Baker's arrest. Next. Throughout World War II, the Crescent Hotel sat empty. Next. Empty save for the faint scampering of rodents and the footsteps of the night watchman. Next. As the boys worked their way through the abandoned Baker Hospital, they made many strange discoveries that told an even stranger story. Next. Instead of sterile white walls within the building, they found circus colored interior Art Deco decor amongst forgotten wheelchairs and cancer is curable posters. Next. They moved deeper into the basement that had served as the hospital morgue and made a very grim discovery. They found the very same macabre set of jars containing human tissue and the so called cancer cure elixirs that would be buried and later unearthed on the hotel grounds almost 80 years later. Next. Now, the boys were both fascinated and horrified by their discovery. Next. But what these boys failed to realize was, next slide, that this abandoned building they entered wasn't really a hospital, nor was it a hotel. Next. It was the remnants of an abandoned theater by a sideshow magician whose performance had ended. Next. His cancer healing elixir was made up of carbolic acid, alcohol, glycerin, and spring water, but his formula's true ingredient and populist rhetoric. Next. The relics discovered by the boys told a story. Next. A story of the past and predictions of the future. Next. Of a charlatan's performance that had been repeated throughout the ages and continues to this day. Next. One that rather than garnish applause as the curtain falls, ends with an empty silence, an empty promise, an empty cure. Next. An empty structure. Next. So Norman Baker died lonely, but throughout his life, those he met became either his devoted followers or his mortal enemies. Even 60 years after his death, he still divides people. Next. Just after his funeral, his grave was destroyed and later replaced. The grave site to this day is mysteriously decorated with purple flowers on the anniversary of his death. Love him or hate him, at the core, this book is about perception. We see history the way we want to see it. Next. So, this very unique uh, graphic nonfiction is my best interpretation of this peculiar person, place, and time. Although Baker has been gone for many years now, echoes of his time in Eureka Springs still reverberate throughout the Crescent Hotel. Next. So I wanted to just briefly kind of go through the process and yeah, that'd be pretty much it. So next. This book blends oral histories, old letters, newspaper articles, and Norman Baker's vanity biography. I began this project back in 2008, Since then, I've interviewed people in both Baker's hometown of Muscatine, Iowa, and Eureka Springs, Arkansas. Next, I've scoured library archives and database and dug through old newspapers, letters, old photos, court documents, books, criminal records, and microfiche. Next, I spent quite a bit of time exploring cemeteries and locating graves of people that are found in this particular book. Next. Then comes the very difficult portion of the process, at least for me, that's organizing all the material into a cohesive narrative. Next. I would file the information in terms of subject matter and period and put together a timeline of events for both Norman Baker and the Crescent Hotel. Next. Once I've done that, I sharpen my pencil and get busy drawing. And that's the cat there is my cat Buzz, and he basically serves as my art director. So next. So I began putting a script together using all the collected interviews, photos, and other research. So originally the story was written in paragraph form and then reworked into a script. I would draw very rough storyboards while scripting the book. Next. So after turning my roughs into final type pencils, I then begin spotting the dark areas using watercolor and building up value for dramatic light and shadow. This is very important for strong contrast and to ensure a good printing quality. Then I introduce color. Much of this book is color coded, so different periods are represented by an overall color tone. Next. Here's a pencil panel next to the final version in full value and color. Next. I often write notes to myself when roughing out pages for this book. Here are my roughs next to my pencils. Okay, next. Now I add value, then color in watercolor, and then digitally adding word balloons, dialogue boxes. Next. Another example from pencils to final color without lettering. Next. And here we can see one more example showing my process. And next. I had to find many props for reference. This includes buying 1930s period model cars, old radios, and finding old medical equipment, and so on. Next. Part of the challenge for 1930s attire is finding period clothing reference that was not only of the area, but also appropriate for the particular region in this book. Next. I thoroughly researched not only the history, but also the geography of the Crescent Hotel throughout its various periods of history. So, next, the hotel becomes more of a character in this book, and the reader will traverse the historic building throughout the various stages of its strange and assorted past. As I mentioned before, at its core, this book is about perception. We all perceive reality and history differently. We all draw from our own interpretations based on a myriad of factors that influence our understanding of places and events. Next. So I look forward to taking you all on this journey, and hopefully, this book will inspire you to continue your story and draw your own conclusions by exploring this most unusual hotel and traversing the same halls the patients and staff of the Baker Hospital did so many years before. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So thank you. And yeah, please sign up for my newsletter and pick up a copy of the book. They're available at my on my website at my store. Um, yeah, there it is.
Well, that was excellent. Thank you for the insight behind the scenes.
Thank you.
So just a few other questions there. I mean, you covered almost everything, but I saw you had, there's clearly a lot of buzz and interest in the book. You had a very successful Kickstarter, it looks like.
Yeah, I did. Thank you. Yeah, that was so yeah, last it was actually at this time last year the Kickstarter campaign was going on. It was an October Kickstarter campaign. And like I said, I've worked on it for so long. I've been telling so many people around it, and it is a local legend. But so I'd never done a Kickstarter campaign, but on so I needed a little over 12,000, I believe, for the initial print run of books, and on day one we passed 15,000 just on the first day, and then at the end of October we made almost $29,000.
Wow,
So
congratulations.
yeah, thank you.
Now, so did you intentionally pick October
Oh,
for Halloween just because it thematically ties in?
absolutely. Yeah.
Because that's why I have you on in October.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. No, you know, my work tends to, I think just the look and feel of my work really does tend to, fits well with this time of year because there is an overall sort of spooky, haunting quality to my work and to the themes of my work, but also just the colors and the textures of my work tend to lend themselves well to the autumn and Halloween and yeah.
Wow. So how many illustrations or panels total are in the book,
Oh God,
roughly?
you know I'm not really sure exactly. I want to say, as far as like how many panels, I would say I think it's somewhere like, oh God, just under 1,000, maybe 800, maybe something like that,
Mhm.
700, 800 some panels, maybe. Because it's 240 pages, and some pages have 6 panels, some just have two, some have four, some are just one. There are a lot of pages that are a full page, but yeah, I would say I think it's somewhere around maybe 6 to 700. I don't know how many ex- different panels
Well,
there are.
about how long would you estimate each one took you, every panel?
Oh wow.
Under your cat's close supervision, of course.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. Well, he actually jumped up here on my table while I was talking, so he had to. he, he- he's always supervising, you know. I would say each page usually as far as the whole page, usually it's a maybe a couple of days of like I. I can sometimes do a page, well, yeah, in a day, but usually it's a couple of days because 2 or 3 days. Because I mean, I'll when it comes from research and then just roughing it all out, final pencils, and then spotting blacks, and then building up value and color. Um, I try very hard to. I like for the work to um, have plenty of contrast so that way when you go to print it's going to look good regardless,
Mhm.
um, because you don't want it to be too light, you don't want it to be, because otherwise it may not printer the printer may not pick up all the details and whatnot. So um, yeah, I try to have that contrast throughout, and I was really happy with the way that the book turned out. It's a beautiful book. It's a beautiful hardcover book, and but yeah, as far as I'd say a couple of days. It's really kind of hard to say because this was one of those projects that involves so many different steps, and it's like it's a nonfiction book, and so you think you're done, and then you find more information that you're like, oh my god, I got to include that in some way, but there comes a point where you're like, okay, I've got to just stop and just work with what I have.
Well, excuse me. Well, I know it's your comfort zone to do illustrations, but did you ever feel like you feel limited or like you were leaving a lot out by not having a lot of text in there?
um no, I have this thing where I always tell myself it's like show it or say it. And so that's the thing. Sometimes people will do, like, I'll see these sort of nonfiction, graphic nonfictions where it becomes a little too, I think, overly didactic, where it'll show something and then it'll say the exact same thing that they're
Mhm.
showing, and it becomes a bit redundant. It's very easy to to become really repetitive with that sort of thing. So that's one of my big rules, is show it or say it. And also an interesting thing in this book, so like when people in the past are talking, it's actual words. It's like I'm taking from actual letter correspondence from these people, and so I'm not just making up what they're saying. So it's really interesting in that way. Um, and a graphic novel and graphic nonfictions are very unique in the sense that, I mean, I love novels. I love to read. I probably read more, I read a lot of books, just all kinds of books in general, nonfiction and fiction. Um, and then here and there, I read graphic novels as well, of course. But that's one of the beautiful things about a graphic novel or graphic narrative, is that, instead of explaining the location or the scene, like, you're drawing it. And so much of books will, spend time with all that. Um, so it's really, in some ways, it's a little bit, there's similarities to, like, film, in a way. I almost look at my storytelling as like I'm doing film on paper. So, because you're kind of
Yeah,
like, as a graphic novelist, or whatever you want to call it, whatever, a visual narrative artist, whatever you want to say. You really are kind of like the director. You're the sound guy. You're the
yeah,
script coordinator. You're everybody. You're the whole team. Is you don't have the budget of a film production, and you have a really, like, an endless budget, because you can do just about anything because you're drawing it.
absolutely. And then people just have to, they visualize the transitions between panels in their heads, which I think if you've read a lot of graphic novels or comics, you start to do that automatically as if it were a movie. So it's
Yeah,
really cool how
that
you can
that's
put that onto the paper. The reader
yeah,
fills in everything.
definitely. There's something magical, I think, about that space in between the two panels, and that it's that space between that separates, a graphic novel from, other forms, like, just a single illustration. It's that sequence of panels and it does, you're right, it is almost like, you kind of develop that, I don't know, that sensitivity to the medium the more you do it, the more you read, graphic novels. And uh and i i i, I really do love the fact that it is this, um it is similar in the sense of a film, where a film you can be somewhat passive and you can just kind of watch, whereas with a graphic novel it's a bit more active,
Right.
but yet it's not. People will I think, like when I'm selling my books, it's like people will look at my book, and they'll be like a little intimidated when they hear, oh, 240 pages. And then they'll open it up and they'll see, oh, well, it's like this visual experience. And it doesn't seem as intimidating, if they don't, maybe they're not wanting to dive into a 240 page book that's, but when they see that, they're like, oh, well, it's like this, like I said, it's kind of a visual experience.
Right.
And so, yeah, I think it's a very unique medium. And I'm really excited that I think more and more people are becoming more interested in the medium. And I also love the fact that I think I'm hoping that, as I tell these kind of stories, more kids will also get, and I mean, just people in general, but also like kids, um, because that I think is a good kind of a stepping stone into reading, novels and larger, books, with more content, or content in the sense that it's all completely, completely or mostly text based. Um, but I think both are equally as valid. It's just another, reading reading panels with visual information is still reading. It's just another way of deciphering. There's a lot of subject and symbols, and it's just another way of interpreting, what you're seeing, and deciphering, or, pulling out the story, the narrative.
Right.
So,
And I feel, and I agree with what you're saying about the passiveness, but also it takes a lot of uh, concentration, because if you miss a panel, you miss as much as you might in a whole page of a text novel.
that's
If you
right.
were to just skim over it quickly and then you have to go back, and it is kind of nice to be able to see it visually, like, okay, I can piece this together. You know,
Yes. That's absolutely right. Yeah. And it's funny. I've had some people that haven't, that are not that used to reading graphic novels, and or graphic nonfictions, what have you. It's like, and they've told me, they're like, well, I read through your book, but then I had to reread it because I was just reading the text and I wasn't really paying attention to the panel. And like you said, I'm thinking, well, then you really missed half the book,
right,
because you really have to like it in it. And it, to properly, read a graphic novel, it should take quite a bit longer than you might think, because you really do need to study each panel, because they're full of lots of information. Like you said, like one panel could be like the equivalent of an entire page in a novel, in
right,
a text-based novel.
right. Yeah, if you're reading that in a novel, you're kind of visualizing
Hmm.
using your own imagination
Yep.
that scene and
Hmm.
over the course of the page, and then but it's there for you, the writer's interpretation
Yeah.
in your case, and
Yeah, for
two
sure.
different experiences.
Yeah, right. It is, and it's one of those things too, that if you do it just right, like if you can blend those two sensibilities, or those two technique, well, the two, it's basically, like graphic novels are just this. If it's done right, it's a beautiful marriage of, of literature and art, and the two just coming together. It's like a night. It's like a dance, where they both are just, they're not stepping on one another's toes, and it
Mhm.
flows effortlessly and smoothly. And and if it's done right, you can really just kind of immerse yourself into the experience. Because like I said, what I mean doing it right, it's like where you're not overwhelmed by too much text, and you're
Mhm.
not overwhelmed, like it's where you're able to tell a huge bit of the story just through the visuals, alone. And if you can do that properly, then it really can just become such a beautiful, um and like I like to say the word immersive, because you do just, and like with this book, I mean, I pay a lot of attention to the actual, space, like the hotel itself, and the even the town of Eureka Springs. And because I want the viewer to feel like they're actually at the hotel throughout all the different periods, and all the I've even color coded like all the different periods, like so that way the reader knows what period you're in. So it's like the
Right.
present has an overall green tone, and then the Baker's period in the late 1930s has an overall purple tonality, and then in the earlier late 1800s is sort of a sepia tone. So it's just another way to kind of visually cue the reader and without confusing them, you know.
Love that.
So
So, so,
yeah.
so how many times in your life would you estimate you've visited the Crescent?
Oh man, it's funny. I've been there. Oh wow, I don't even know. 50 maybe. I don't so many times. I mean, what's funny is I've been there like um many times, like without like sometimes I've just like I've done classes like at the Eureka Springs School of the Arts, and they'll just put me up at the Crescent Hotel. Like I've stayed there without even really. I'll just end up doing some like research, but I'm actually staying there for something else, you know? And so it's kind of funny how that works. And I also one time when I was working on the book, I did a week-long residency at the Writers Colony at Dairy Hollow, which is in Eureka Springs. In fact, it's just down the hill from the Crescent Hotel. So I would walk up to the Crescent just every day, and I'd walk all over town interviewing people. But then I would go back to the Crescent in the evening and just kind of walk around and talk to people. And yeah, I mean, like I said, it is at the highest point of town,
Hmm.
in Eureka Springs. So it's really a nice place to kind of sit up on the like I would go in the evenings and just go sit up on their it's they call it the Baker's Lounge, I think is what they call like their little bar area up on, just go get a drink and sit there, and I'd have my sketchbook and just sit up there and draw or
Hmm. Is
uh
that on the other side of the Pizza Sky Bar?
I I it, I guess well no, I mean are they calling it something different now? It used to be like the Baker. I can't even remember what they're calling it now. Maybe it probably is maybe I'm thinking of the Sky Bar. Is that at the very top? Isn't that at the very top of the
Yeah, the one that's has a beautiful sunset
Yeah,
view, and you can see
right.
the Christ of the Ozarks and all that.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I'd go up there and I would just kind of sit there with my sketchbook and have a drink and just kind of look out and just yeah, I'd usually just end up talking to people that work there or something. It was funny. I mean, I've just interviewed so many people, and so many times that just kind of happens organically. I just like to meet people and talk to people, and yeah, I would just be up there, and next thing you know, I'm just talking to someone that works there, and and everybody has a different, you know, story about the town. Eureka is so interesting because mm, are from somewhere else, and they move there, because it's such an interesting place, and they're truly interested in the history. Like I've never been to a town where so many people have an understanding of the history of the town they live in. It's like it's really wild. But almost anybody you talk to, it's like they're a historian, for
Mhm.
of Eureka Springs. It's pretty cool, you know.
Yeah. That's kinda how Hot Springs is in a way, but I bet there's a lot
Yeah.
more, urban legends that everyone thinks they know something and
Uh, right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, Hot Springs, yeah, that's also another one of the truly unique and interesting towns, in Arkansas. And they both have springs, right? Like Eureka
exactly.
Springs and Hot Springs, right? Yeah. And they both have these crazy histories.
Yeah, absolutely. Have you one of the most popular books to highlight Hot Springs recently was The Vapors by David Hill. Have you had a chance to check
Oh,
that one out?
no. Uh-uh.
Definitely should. It's named after our nightclub that back in our gambling heyday in the 50s and 60s, had a popular nightclub. It's now a music venue that's reopened. It's gone through a few phases, but you should absolutely check that out. Came out a couple years ago, and
Wow.
David Hill was actually my first ever virtual guest, like you're doing right now.
Oh,
His,
excellent.
his book came out just a few months into the pandemic, and
Oh,
yep.
excellent. Yeah, that sounds fantastic. That's around the time I was finishing this book. So, yeah, I'll have to check that out. I have done a little bit of some art with that's hot springs related. I was on a production team doing production art for a documentary film, and it was called The First Boys of Spring, and it was about spring training in hot springs
Uh,
during the early 20th century. It was, in the cover has Babe Ruth on there, because all these these baseball teams would come and practice in the spring, and I mean huge names like Satchel Paige and Babe Ruth. In fact, when you open, like, the front cover has Babe Ruth, and what's one of the stories is how he hits a home run that landed over in the alligator
right.
farm.
I was just about
And
that.
yeah, and so I drew on the cover of the cover has Babe Ruth hitting the ball, and then when you turn the DVD over, it's a DVD, so it has a DVD cover, and so it's like you turn the DVD over, or the DVD cover or whatever. Um, there's an alligator and it's standing there, it's got an alligator, and there's a baseball sitting next to there's some alligators just all hanging out, and you're like, what? And it's they're in the alligator farm, and then on the inside, I drew, it painted, Satchel Paige is in there, and so it's really interesting. I mean, um, they both just have such a interesting past, and they both have these hotels, that are very well known, or well, pretty well known within within the
The
region,
region.
and uh-huh.
Well,
So
that's a lesson to future town founders. Pick a place that has natural springs and put springs in the name, and your town will have a rich history.
right, yeah. Yeah, one thing that's really funny about, so my book's not really about, like, the ghost stuff about the crest. I mean, I talk about that because, it has such a haunted sort of past, but I look at it like a ghost story is like a good ghost tour should be a good history tour, tell you about the history of a place. And one time I was listening to a podcast that really, it wasn't about it wasn't even an Arkansas podcast, but they were talking about places that have, like, hauntings and stuff like that, that are known to be haunted and all that kind of thing. And what's funny is they said that whoever I can't remember exactly the person they were talking to, said that two of the things that uh, are prevalent in most of these places that are haunted throughout the world or whatever, they have two components. Or one of them is they're near water, and then another thing is there's large concentrations of limestone. And so the Crescent Hotels on over Springs, I guess, if I don't know, I guess it checks out. I don't know. And of course it has a crazy history. So
Mhm. Well, in recognition of the upcoming holiday, do you have a favorite ghost story to share?
uh, a favorite, like a Crescent Hotel ghost
Mhm.
story, is that, oh man, honestly, the thing that always kind of just spooked me out as a kid was, that relates back to the Crescent Hotel, is and I've never actually seen this myself, but people oftentimes, when they're at the Crescent, they'll talk about seeing someone. Uh, um, Oftentimes it's like they'll hear, like, the sound of wheels, or like the sound of, like, a gurney or something being pushed outside their hotel room, and they'll go outside and they won't see anything. Or I've even heard some people have said that they would see a woman who looks like she's in period clothing, like a nurse, pushing a wheelchair down a hallway, and then they'd go, up to ask her a question. She'd turn a corner, and then she'd just be gone. And I don't know. Who knows if I, you know, I can't substantiate any of it, but I think it's sure spooky, to think, s- you know, um, and I don't really know if that. I mean, if that's a phenomenon, that really is really does happen. Maybe it's like something that these kind of things that just are repeated, over and over, and it just kind of creates this almost like an imprint in the fabric of, like you just whatever in the ether or whatever, and it's like, but regardless, and I've heard other stories where people have they'd be down in the like the old, like the ballroom down the dining room, I should say, like downstairs in the Crescent Hotel, and they'd see a group of people sitting at a table, and and when it's supposed to be closed, it's like people that work there,
Hmm.
and then they'd come back and be like, "Hey, it's time to close. We're closing up," and then they'd go do some stuff, and they come back, and then they'd just be gone. And so, I've heard a lot of that sort of thing. So I don't know. But I do love the idea of just the. I think there's something really spooky about just seeing a nurse in period clothing pushing a gurney or a wheelchair down the hallways of this old hotel late at night. There's something kind of spooky about about that. My in my book, I mean, the nurse is pushing one of the a deceased patient down to the morgue, but she's pushing them and I found this out is like it was actually they would push him in a wheelchair because the elevator, since this wasn't a hospital originally, the elevator doesn't you wouldn't be able to fit a gurney in there, so they would use wheelchairs. So, but that's pretty spooky right there too. Just that imagery, and it's in my book, so you can see that in my book. I do. What's funny is I did draw a page, and it's penciled. I may just one of these days I'm going to go ahead and finish that. And I did sort of a scenario of a guy doing that, just that, where the woman in the present day is talking, sees a woman pass him, pushing a wheelchair, and then he goes to ask her a question. He turns the corner and she's gone. So I may just have to do that just to post and be kind of fun.
Yeah,
Maybe
little.
next Halloween when I have some time.
Well, it's a fascinating hotel, and I'm sure there's a lot of history. You're only cracking the surface here. Very, very,
Oh, I know, I know.
but
Yeah,
I recommend anyone viewing this check it out if you want a little 2-day vacation or something, and bring Sean's book with you and kind of
yeah.
get in the mood, inspire.
Right. Yeah. And I drew it deliberately, like I said, like the landmarks, everything is accurate, like as to location, where it's located, and so yeah, you can definitely. I wanted that to be a book where people could take it with them, and they'd be like, oh yeah, I know exactly where this is located because
Mhm.
I mean, I actually sat there at a lot of these places when I was making the book, taking pictures and drawing from these locations. So yeah, you'll be able to spot them in the book. So
Excellent.
it'll enhance your trip to Eureka Springs and the Crescent Hotel. So,
All right, Sean. Well, it
all
has
right.
been a pleasure, and I prepared for. But why don't
Yep.
you remind everyone where they can find you, buy your book, and anything else you have coming up?
Okay, great. Yeah. So my book is available at my website right now. That's where it's at my website. Eventually, maybe in a month or so, I'll have them up on Amazon. But right now, it's at my website, and I'll have them in Eureka Springs and more in Fayetteville and whatnot. But right now, like I said, yeah, at SeanFitzgibbon.com or SeanFitzgibbonArt.com, I have both URLs. And then let's see, I've got what's coming up in Arkansas. I've actually got a show, an exhibition at the Muscatine Art Center in Muscatine, Iowa. So unless you're in Muscatine, you may not go to that, but I'm going to have an exhibit at the Eureka Springs Historical Museum. I'm going to have some pieces along with actual Baker memorabilia, and that's going to be on November the 2nd, I believe, that Wednesday, whatever that Wednesday is. I believe it's the 2nd. And also on October 31st, on Halloween, I'm going to have about let me think here, about 20 original pages on display at the Fayetteville Public Library in what's called their Lucky Day Gallery, and which is a beautiful space. Like the library is just, the Fayetteville Public Library is an amazing place, and that'll be on display there, as well as the Eureka Springs Historical Museum. And yeah, and I'm also, yeah, so I've got a lot of things coming up. If you go to my blog on my website, you can see everything coming up, as well as my oh yeah, and I have work at CALS, the Central Arkansas Library System in Little Rock, in their gallery space there at CALS, and I will also be I'll be doing a panel on that Saturday before Halloween, whatever that Saturday is, that last Saturday of October.
The 29th.
The 29th. So yeah, I'll be giving a panel at there at the Central Arkansas Library System. It'll be part of the Six Bridges Book Festival, and so yeah, you can look up that. And I'll be giving a talk with another graphic novelist as well, or a woman that does graphic nonfiction, and is also a New Yorker cartoonist.
Wow.
So yeah, that'll be fun. I'm in that. So yeah, lots coming up. I'm also going to be at the Paranormal Fest in that same weekend, the 29th and 30th in Little Rock. So
excellent. Quite a schedule you have.
Yeah, it is. So,
well, excellent. Well, congratulations again on a successful book launch, and
thank you.
hope everybody watching enjoyed this. You can, if you enjoy watching, share the recording, get the word out about the book at the hotel. You can share this whether you're watching on Facebook or YouTube. And thanks again, Sean, and
all right,
happy Halloween to you and anyone else.
Yeah, thanks. Happy Halloween to you too, Paul. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Take care.
All right, you too.